Birmingham, 1919. The war had ended, but peace never truly arrived. When the guns fell silent in France, men came home to another kind of battlefield. The factories, the streets, the hunger. And in the chaos of a rebuilding city, power was there for the taking. Amid the smog and the struggle stood one family, determined not to bow, but to rule. Thomas Shelby. Soldier, strategist, survivor. A man who came back from the war with nightmares in his head. And a plan in his hands. He learned leadership in the mud. He learned patience under fire. And when he returned home, he turned those lessons into a business, built not on paper, but on fear. With Polly Gray managing the books, Arthur keeping the streets in line, and the rest of the family ready to bleed for the cause, the Shelby Company was born. But this wasn't your usual company. Its offices were betting shops. Its contracts were sealed in whiskey and smoke. And its competition didn't last long. They called themselves the Peaky Blinders because the last thing their enemies ever saw was the peak of a hat and a flash of steel. But beneath the blood and the smoke was a system, a method. Every hit, every deal, every silence bought had purpose. They didn't just fight for territory. They built a network turning Birmingham into a boardroom and fear into currency. This isn't just a story about gangsters in flat caps. It's a story about vision, about men who turned crime into structure and power into legacy. This is how the Peaky Blinders ran their operations. Birmingham was a city of smoke and noise, a place where steel and sweat built fortunes for a few and misery for the many. The streets of Small Heath were narrow and unforgiving, littered with soot, horse dung, and desperation. Out of those streets, boys grew into men faster than they should have. They learned that a strong fist could feed a family quicker than a job at the factory. Among those boys were the Shelby's sons and daughters of the working class, forged in hardship and destined to become something far greater than anyone expected. Arthur was the eldest, rough around the edges and violent when pushed, but loyal like no other. He carried the burden of being the oldest, the one who had to make sure no one went hungry. Polly, their aunt, was the matriarch, sharp, cunning, and wiser than most men who claimed to run businesses in Birmingham. Ada, the youngest of the family, saw the world differently. She dreamed beyond the soot and smoke, wanted to escape, and hated the dirt that clung to their name. And then there was Thomas Calm, calculated, unreadable. Even as a boy, there was something about him that others followed without question. In those early years, the Shelbys were just another family trying to survive. But survival in Small Heath wasn't about hard work. It was about being harder than the next man. The local gangs controlled the neighborhoods. Every corner, every pub, every betting stall had a price. If you wanted to breathe easy, you paid. If you didn't, you bled. The Peaky Blinders name started as a whisper. A group of young men who stitched razor blades into the peaks of their caps, not for fashion, but for war. They weren't an army yet, not even a syndicate, but they were something dangerous. Organized chaos. Their first hustles were small but smart. Black market goods from the docks, stolen whiskey, counterfeit ration cards, and bookmaking on illegal races. Arthur ran the muscle collecting debts and reminding people who really ran the neighborhood. Polly handled the books, making sure the money flowed and the coppers stayed quiet. And Tommy? He was the one who saw the pattern in the madness. While others fought for territory, he was already thinking about structure, about turning crime into something that could last. What set them apart wasn't just their ruthlessness, but their discipline. The Peaky Blinders operated like soldiers long before Tommy went to war. They had hierarchy, codes, and silence. Nothing happened in Small Heath without a Shelby knowing about it. And in a city filled with desperation, they offered what no one else could: protection and opportunity. You could hate them, but you couldn't ignore them. When the First World War broke out, everything changed. Birmingham emptied of its young men. Tommy and Arthur were sent to the front lines, and what they saw there burned away whatever innocence they had left. The trenches were hell-endless mud, the stench of blood and gunpowder, men screaming in the dark. For Tommy, the war wasn't just survival, it was education. He learned strategy, patience, how to command fear and respect without raising his voice. The boy who had once fought for pennies on the street came back a man who could command men like battalions. Arthur returned broken, the noise of the guns still ringing in his head, his temper shorter than ever. But Tommy came back sharper. The war had stripped him of mercy, but it had given him vision. He looked at Birmingham and didn't just see home anymore, he saw opportunity. The same tactics that won him battles in France could win him empires at home. The gangs of Small Heath were still fighting like animals over scraps, but Tommy saw something bigger: control, expansion, business. He reorganized everything. The old street fights became negotiations. The random robberies turned into planned operations. The betting business grew, spreading beyond Birmingham. Tommy treated the gang like an army, and his family like lieutenants. Polly became the chief financial officer before the title even existed. Arthur was the enforcer, feared in every pub and alley. John handled the day-to-day operations, collecting from bookmakers and dealing with rival gangs. Ada, though she never wanted a part in it, became a bridge to respectability, someone who could move in circles. The rest couldn't. And the city responded. The Peaky Blinders weren't just thugs anymore. They were businessmen, criminal businessmen, yes, but with rules, order, and structure. They paid off the right police officers, formed alliances with politicians, and even made deals with the Irish and the Italians. Under Tommy's leadership, chaos became empire. The bookmaking operation became the foundation, but it was only the start. Smuggling, protection rackets, and later, political influence, it all grew from those first hustles in the back streets of Small Heath. The original Peaky Blinders of history weren't far from this truth. The name came from real men who walked Birmingham's streets in the late 1800s, gangsters who used violence and intimidation to control their turf. But by the 1920s, those original blinders had faded, replaced by new blood and sharper minds. The Shelbys, fictional as they are, were built on that legacy, a family that represented what Birmingham had become, a city of grit, survival, and reinvention. Tommy's genius was understanding that fear could be managed like money. He didn't need to kill everyone who opposed him, just enough to make sure the rest remembered. Every action was calculated, every threat strategic. When he spoke, men listened. When he stayed silent, they feared what he might be thinking. That was leadership born in the trenches, moulded by war and sharpened by ambition. The family's rise wasn't without cost. Violence followed them everywhere. Rivals like Billy Kimber and later the Sabinis saw the Shelbys as a threat. Blood was spilled, alliances broken, and every victory came with scars. But through it all, Tommy kept his focus to move the family from the back streets into the boardrooms, to make the Shelby name untouchable. At its heart, the Peaky Blinders story is about transformation. From slum kids scraping for pennies to a syndicate controlling the city's pulse, they built their world brick by brick, deal by deal. They turned illegal bookmaking into organized business, street fights into political strategy, and their family into an institution. Tommy knew something most gangsters didn't, that power wasn't just about muscle, it was about perception. He dressed like a gentleman, spoke like a businessman, and made sure that when people looked at him, they saw someone who belonged in power. The war had shown him the value of image and control, and he used both like weapons. By the time the Shelbys began expanding, the old Birmingham gangs were relics. They were still fighting over pub corners while Tommy was planning trade routes. He moved product through canals, turned allies into partners, and enemies into examples. And through all of it, he never forgot where he came from: the streets, the soot, the hunger. Small Heath was more than home. It was proof that you could build an empire out of ashes. The Peaky Blinders weren't born into privilege, they made it, piece by piece, from the broken stones of their city. They were soldiers of circumstance who refused to stay soldiers forever. And as Tommy stared out over the rooftops of Birmingham, cigarette burning low between his fingers, he knew one thing for certain: the war had ended, but his battle had only just begun. Because for men like Thomas Shelby, peace was never the goal. Power was. Birmingham was changing, and so was Thomas Shelby. The man who had once walked through mud and blood now walked through the city's smoke with the calm of someone who had already seen worse. He had survived the trenches, and compared to that, no rival, no copper, no threat could shake him. But what made Tommy different wasn't just his survival. It was what he brought back with him. The discipline of a soldier, the calculation of a strategist, and the silence of a man who'd buried too many voices in his mind. The small Heath streets that had once looked like home now looked like opportunity. Tommy no longer wanted to be king of the back alleys. He wanted control, real control, the kind that didn't vanish when the police showed up. He looked at the chaos around him. Gangs fighting for scraps, money lost to middlemen, fear running wild, and he saw what none of them did. That order could be more powerful than violence. He began to shift the family's focus. The Peaky Blinders were no longer just collecting debts and running illegal bets. They were building systems. Tommy knew that the bookmakers and gangsters would keep losing money as long as they stayed underground. So he began his first real business gamble, the plan to make betting legitimate, or at least appear that way. With Polly handling the ledgers, he began approaching businessmen who wanted to profit without getting their hands dirty. They would fund the bets. The Shelbys would handle the risk. It was an early form of partnership black market finance disguised as enterprise. The first real test came when they moved into legal horse racing. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about territory. Billy Kimber ran the racing business in Birmingham, and his men controlled who could set foot on the grounds. Tommy didn't challenge him head-on. He studied him. He watched Kimber's routines, his temper, his weaknesses. And when the time came, Tommy made his move not with bullets, but with precision. He struck deals with Kimber's suppliers, bribed his bookkeepers, and slowly cut off the flow of money. By the time Kimber realized what was happening, Tommy wasn't knocking at the door, he was sitting in the office. That was his genius. He didn't conquer by force, he conquered by control. Violence was always the last option, but it was always on the table. When Tommy finally faced Kimber, it wasn't just two gangsters meeting, it was two eras colliding. The old Birmingham of fists and fear against the new Birmingham of calculation and profit. When the meeting ended, Kimber was either an ally or a memory, depending on which version you believed. But everyone in the city understood one thing. Thomas Shelby had arrived. The Peaky Blinders were now more than a gang. They were a brand. Their suits were sharper, their operations cleaner, and their money moved like clockwork. The pubs they once fought in became their headquarters, and the same men who had once mocked them now paid them for protection. Tommy had turned chaos into hierarchy. Even his enemies began to admire how he ran things like a businessman who understood war, or a soldier who understood business. But beneath the calm, the war still lived inside him. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, when the gunfire in his head drowned out the quiet. He would sit alone, cigarette burning low, eyes fixed on nothing. That silence, that stillness was where the war replayed itself. Every deal he made, every calculated move, was another way to keep the noise under control. For Tommy, ambition wasn't just hunger, it was survival. His brothers didn't understand it the same way. Arthur was lost in the aftershocks of the war, his temper volatile, his guilt unhealed. Polly tried to hold the family together, reminding Tommy that money wasn't everything. But Tommy had already crossed a line in his mind. He had seen what chaos did to men, and he would never let it touch his family again, even if that meant becoming the very thing he once fought against. As the Peaky Blinders expanded, their reputation grew. They moved from Birmingham's slums to its upper streets, then beyond the city into London, into Ireland, into the kind of circles where decisions were made behind closed doors. Tommy knew how to talk to men who wore suits instead of scars. He could negotiate with a politician in the morning and intimidate a gangster at night. And that duality, that perfect balance between civility and violence, was what made him unstoppable. Each new territory came with new enemies, but Tommy didn't rush. He studied every move like a chess player. He used information as a weapon. His network of informants grew policemen, port workers, accountants, all paid to keep the Peaky Blinders one step ahead. And when diplomacy failed, he reminded his enemies why the razors in their caps weren't just for show. By now, even the police understood that they weren't dealing with common criminals. Inspector Campbell, sent from Belfast to bring order, quickly realized that Tommy Shelby was a different breed. Every attempt to trap him only tightened the web Tommy had already spun. He had files, leverage, and secrets enough to make even the law hesitate. The Shelbys weren't hiding from authority anymore. They were sitting at the same table. But the cost of control was coldness. The more Tommy built, the more he detached. The boy who once fought for family was now fighting for legacy. Polly saw it in his eyes, the emptiness that came after every victory. Ada saw it in the way he couldn't hold on to peace, even when it was within reach. The war had carved something out of him that no amount of power could replace. Yet that that emptiness drove him further. The Peaky Blinders expansion became methodical, like military campaigns. He mapped out new routes for whiskey, negotiated trade deals with the Irish, and even began courting political figures who could protect their growing business empire. The name Shelby started to carry weight not just in Birmingham, but across Britain. And behind every calm negotiation, every handshake, was Tommy's unspoken rule. Never let emotion make a decision that calculation could make better. Still, there were cracks beneath the surface. The nightmares, the moments of rage, the long silences when he'd disappear for days, all of it hinted at the war still raging inside him. But no one dared question him. To the world, Thomas Shelby was the perfect leader, ruthless, visionary, untouchable. To himself, he was a man still fighting ghosts, still building something to drown out the echo of artillery in his head. And as the empire grew, so did the myth. People began to whisper not just about the gang, but about the man. They said he could predict the future, that he never blinked under pressure, that his eyes could see through lies. But the truth was simpler. He just understood human nature. He knew that everyone had a price, a fear or a weakness. All he had to do was find it. By the time the Peaky Blinders had taken full control of Birmingham's betting and trade, Tommy had achieved what no gangster before him could. He had turned chaos into order. His family no longer answered to anyone, and every rival who once laughed at the Shelbys was either an ally or a name carved in memory. But as Tommy looked out over his growing empire, he knew it wasn't enough. The city was his, but the world was still waiting. And deep down, he understood something dark and inevitable, that to keep what he had built, he'd have to become colder, harder, and smarter than ever before. For a man like Thomas Shelby, peace wasn't a destination. It was just a pause between battles. Power changes a man. It sharpens him, tests him, bends him in directions he never expected. For Thomas Shelby, power was not a trophy. It was a system to be mastered. By the early 1920s, the streets of Birmingham no longer ran wild. They ran on Shelby time. Every bet, every shipment, every whisper of a deal moved through their network. What had once been a gang now resembled something far more complex, a machine. Tommy had turned crime into a corporation. It began with structure. Tommy had learned in the war that no army survives without chain of command, and he brought that logic home. Each member of the family had a defined role. Arthur, brutal and unpredictable, became the head of enforcement. His job was control through fear, making sure debts were paid, and loyalty never wavered. John oversaw local operations, managing the betting shops, bookkeepers, and small-time dealers. Ada, though still reluctant, acted as the respectable face of the family. Someone who could talk to bankers, lawyers, and journalists when appearances mattered. And Polly was the backbone, the financial mind, the one who could make numbers dance and money disappear. She ran the books like a CFO before the term existed. Nothing moved without her approval, and every deal Tommy made eventually passed across her desk. Together, they formed something Birmingham had never seen before: organized crime with an accountant's precision. The Peaky Blinders no longer relied on chaos or muscle alone. They had departments, meetings, rules, even written records coded in ledgers that only Polly and Tommy could decipher. They were not thugs with razors anymore. They were businessmen in flat caps. The empire started with betting the old reliable. Tommy standardized every illegal bookmaker in their reach. Each man paid a cut, followed the same odds, and reported to a central office. The chaos of street betting vanished. With Polly's careful balance sheets, the profits doubled in months. Then came expansion pubs, factories, and shipping warehouses. The pubs were fronts for meetings. The factories laundered money, and the ships moved goods no one dared to list on manifests. Smuggling was next. Whiskey, cigarettes, opium. Whatever the law said was forbidden, the Shelbys saw as profitable. The ports of Liverpool and Belfast became their arteries. Shipments arrived at night, offloaded quietly, stored in warehouses registered under legitimate companies. Tommy's genius lay in the illusion of legality. On paper, everything looked clean. Invoices, ownership documents, and even tax filings. Behind the ink, however, was a world of bribes, secret compartments, and deals made in the dark. But running an empire required more than clever paperwork. It required control, psychological, financial, and political. Tommy began to cultivate relationships with people who mattered. Local politicians who could grant licenses. Police officers who could make evidence vanish. Businessmen who wanted a piece of his growing wealth. He offered them shares in legitimate ventures, dinners in respectable clubs, and a taste of the Shelby fortune. Most took it. Those who didn't simply faded from relevance. Tommy's goal was clear: to make the Peaky Blinders untouchable. Every layer of legality added a shield. Factories made their money clean. Pubs generated tax receipts, and betting was slowly moving toward government recognition. When the authorities came knocking, Tommy handed them paperwork and a donation for their campaign funds. Polly understood what he was doing, even if she didn't always agree. She managed the flow of money like an artist, ensuring nothing connected too directly. She knew which bank accounts were safe, which businesses could take losses, and how to balance the family's wealth between respectability and secrecy. Behind her composed face was a woman carrying the weight of a criminal empire, yet she did it with the grace of someone born for more. In boardrooms and pubs alike, Tommy Shelby's presence commanded silence. His calmness was not emptiness, it was calculation. He could look across a table and see the entire game unfolding 3 moves ahead. His enemies never knew if he was bluffing, and his allies never knew if they were next. What they did know was this: underestimating Thomas Shelby was the last mistake anyone made twice. As the money poured in, the Shelbys began investing in visible success. Real estate, car companies, small industries that would one day define Birmingham's economy. On the surface, they were becoming legitimate business people, but underneath, the machine still roared. The men on the docks still loaded crates at night, and the razors still glinted under the brim of their caps. The line between legal and illegal blurred until it no longer mattered. Tommy believed that respect was worth more than fear, but he understood that fear often bought respect faster. Every rival gang that tried to rise the Lees, the Sabinis, the remnants of Kimber's men was either crushed or absorbed. When words failed, Arthur's men handled the rest. But violence was no longer random. It was strategic. Each act had purpose. Each threat served a business end. By now, even the public had started to rewrite their perception of the Peaky Blinders. Newspapers no longer called them gangsters. They called them industrialists, entrepreneurs, or simply men of influence. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy. He read those papers with quiet amusement, knowing that half the city's progress was funded by his illegal fortune. Birmingham was being rebuilt, its factories, its workers, its economy, and at the centre of that reconstruction stood the Shelby Company Limited. But the greater the empire grew, the heavier the burden became. Tommy rarely smiled anymore. The weight of control, the paranoia of betrayal, and the ghosts of France still haunted him. His nights were long, filled with smoke and silence. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw the trenches again, the mud, the fear, the noise, and he reminded himself that this empire he was building was not for glory. It was for security, a fortress against chaos. Polly saw the change in him. She warned him that money without peace was a curse, but Tommy couldn't stop. To him, the next deal, the next acquisition, the next expansion was the only way to silence the storm inside. He had turned the family business into a mechanism for control, not just of Birmingham, but of himself. The empire stretched beyond borders. Deals with the Irish brought in weapons and liquor. Connections in London opened doors to political circles. Even the Americans began to take notice. Rumours spread that the Shelbys were negotiating with foreign investors, smuggling whiskey into ports controlled by men in expensive suits and hidden alliances. Tommy played them all the gangsters, the capitalists, the politicians, knowing that in business, morality was just another currency. Still, he maintained the image of respectability. He attended charity dinners, spoke in public about rebuilding Birmingham, donated to war widows. Every good deed was a shield, every handshake another layer of armour. To the common people, he was a symbol of post-war success, a man who had risen from nothing and given back to his city. To those who knew him, he was something more dangerous, a man who had learned to weaponize trust. Arthur, on the other hand, struggled to fit into the new order. The boardroom was not his battlefield. He longed for the simplicity of the old days, when problems were solved with fists, not ledgers. Tommy tried to keep him close, to protect him from himself, but the divide was growing. For every deal Tommy closed in a suit, Arthur fought his own war in the bottle. The empire was thriving, but the family beneath it was fracturing. Despite that, the Shelby Company continued to expand. They controlled the ports, the racing tracks, and soon even the factories that built the city's machines. Their empire had roots in every layer of society, from the workers in flat caps to the lords in top hats. Tommy's ambition was relentless. He wanted not just money or territory, but permanence, something that would outlive them all. He often said that business and war were the same game, played by different rules. The goal wasn't just to win, it was to ensure the enemy never recovered. And as his rivals fell one by one, the Peaky Blinders stood unchallenged. But behind every fortune is a story written in shadows. Tommy's control depended on silence from the police, from partners, from his own family. The system he built was perfect on paper, but fragile in reality. One wrong move, one betrayal, and the entire structure could crumble. He knew it, yet he couldn't stop building. Because for Thomas Shelby, there was no finish line. Every victory only revealed the next battle. And as his empire rose higher, so did the fall waiting in its shadow. For now, though, the streets of Birmingham moved to his rhythm. The factories roared, the trains carried his goods, and every man who made a living in that city owed something directly or indirectly to Thomas Shelby. The boy from Small Heath had built more than a gang. He had built an institution. And as he stood in his office overlooking the smoky skyline, the sound of hammers and horses below, he whispered a truth that defined him. There's no rest for men like us. Only work, always work. Because power, once taken, can never be put down. It demands everything: time, loyalty, blood. And Tommy Shelby, the man who turned crime into commerce, was prepared to give it all. Birmingham changed its scent once the Shelbys learned how to bottle it. What once smelled like coal and rain soon carried the aroma of money, sharp, metallic, intoxicating. By the mid-20s, the Peaky Blinders had grown past street fights and corner bets. Now they were running a machine, one that didn't creak or shout, but hummed quietly in polished offices, ledgers, and coded telegrams. Every coin that passed through their hands had fingerprints from 3 continents. Every handshake carried the weight of a contract, written in silence and sealed with loyalty. And at the center of it all stood Thomas Shelby, the architect of organized chaos. He had stopped thinking like a gangster. Now he thought like a banker, like a trader, like a politician with dirt under his nails. The first wheel of the money machine was horse race fixing. Birmingham's working-class men would crowd the tracks, betting their week's wages on chance, not knowing chance was rigged long before the race began. Tommy's crew didn't leave outcomes to luck. They bought jockeys, intimidated trainers, and paid off timekeepers. A whisper here, a delay there, and a slow horse suddenly found wings. Each miracle finish meant a flood of cash into Shelby pockets. The beauty of it? It looked legal. Bookmakers never questioned consistent winners when the system itself was bent. Polly Gray kept records cleaner than any accountant. In her notebooks, every pound was double-counted, every expense disguised. She'd shift profits from race wins into consulting fees, transport costs, or warehouse maintenance. If inspectors ever came knocking, the books would tell a story of a hard-working industrial firm, not a betting syndicate that owned half of Birmingham's trackside. Ada handled the political side writing to newspapers, hosting quiet dinners for city councillors, using her charm as cover for Shelby interests. She knew the price of influence, a seat at the table, and a glass raised in silence. When reporters asked how the Shelby company grew so fast, Ada would smile and talk about innovation. Innovation was her polite word for bribery. Once the betting racket ran itself, Tommy's eye turned toward liquid gold whiskey. Post-war Britain had limits, taxes, shortages, but across the Atlantic, Americans were drowning in thirst. Prohibition turned alcohol into treasure, and the Shelbys had a supply chain eager to feed that hunger. The first shipments were small, barrels smuggled under false paperwork, labelled machine oil. But soon entire freighters left Liverpool under the Shelby name, bound for Boston and New York. Inside, whiskey bottled in Midlands factories, escorted by paid customs officers who never saw a thing. It was a dance of deception, 1 barrel to the law, 10 to the mob. Across the ocean, Irish dock workers and Italian middlemen received the goods. Each shipment came with coded letters, sealed with the Shelby stamp. Money returned through shell companies, textile firms, export agencies, cultural organizations. Every coin washed clean through respectability. That's how the Shelbys built international respect, by pretending to be legitimate while outsmarting those who actually were. Tommy called it symmetry. Make the crime look like business. Make the business feel like crime. And the public never knew which was which. Sit. Whiskey made them rich. Arms deals made them untouchable. Tommy had connections in the black market, left over from the war soldiers who still had access to warehouses of forgotten weapons. Rifles, grenades, and ammunition relics from the trenches turned into currency. At first, it was local, selling to miners and radicals preparing for uprisings. But as Europe's politics trembled, demand spread. Irish Republicans, Balkan smugglers, even French extremists found their way to Birmingham, where a quiet meeting in a back room could arm a revolution. Tommy didn't care who fought whom he sold to both sides if the price was right. Polly hated it, but she couldn't argue with the profits. Each deal brought them closer to real power, not just money, but leverage. Soon, their warehouses doubled as fronts for metal exports. Boxes of rifles travelled under invoices for machine parts. Workers never asked questions. They were paid too well to wonder why bolts rattled like bullets. The network expanded. Factories by day, smuggling ports by night. One by one, legitimate industries became laundries for Shelby wealth. They invested in construction, textiles, shipping. Every pound earned in blood came back gleaming like it had been baptized in holy water. Tommy's real genius wasn't in what he stole, it was in how he made everyone believe he'd earned it. He sponsored charity galas, shook hands with MPs, bought art for the city museum. The same man who fixed races now donated to orphanages. Newspapers called him a visionary industrialist. Only a few men knew the truth, and most of them were buried in shallow graves. Behind the respectability, the machine never stopped running. Whiskey flowed, guns travelled, and the ledgers grew thicker. Every new business was a gear that turned another. He had built something even kings envied, an empire that didn't need a crown. But success had its own scent, and others could smell it. Rival gangs tried to muscle in. Police tried to investigate. Tommy countered with precision. A constable received a promotion just before he asked the wrong question. A journalist suddenly got an anonymous tip about someone else's scandal. Problems vanished like smoke under streetlight rain. Even the government found use for him. When order collapsed in the post-war years, men like Tommy Shelby became unofficial tools of stability, the devils you hire to keep worse devils at bay. He provided security services, kept unions quiet, gathered information. All for the right price, of course. By the late 20s, Birmingham had become the testing ground for a new kind of power: corporate crime. The Shelbys weren't thugs anymore. They were administrators of the underworld. Meetings replaced brawls, strategy replaced chaos. Tommy's handwriting was now more dangerous than any blade Arthur ever swung. Their motto had changed too. Once it was about survival. Now it was about permanence. No more hiding in alleys. They were buying the alleys. Owning the streets their boots once patrolled. Each brother had a department. Arthur oversaw enforcement, keeping fear alive enough to maintain respect. John handled logistics, making sure every shipment arrived and every rival disappeared. Polly was the mind, the quiet architect who made crime look like accounting. Ada smoothed the political edges, turning whispers into opportunities. Together, They made something Birmingham had never seen before. A criminal empire that looked cleaner than the church books. But beneath the suits and cigars, something colder thrummed. Tommy's eyes no longer flashed with the hunger of a dreamer. They burned with calculation. The war had taught him how to lead men into death without blinking. Now he led them into profit the same way. Emotion was replaced by arithmetic. A man's worth was measured in margins, not loyalty. He once told Polly, "We don't sell sin anymore. We sell structure." And in that single line lay the future of crime itself. What he built wasn't a gang. It was a prototype for modern organized business, rooted in fear, but dressed in respectability. He had discovered the ultimate trick. If you look legitimate long enough, people stop checking. By 1930, the Shelby Company Limited stood as one of the region's most profitable firms, officially dealing in construction, imports, and manufacturing. Unofficially, it ran the arteries of Britain's black economy. Police departments turned a blind eye, politicians smiled at photo ops, and bankers happily cashed in deposits that smelled faintly of whiskey and gunpowder. Every coin was washed clean through respectability. That's how the machine worked, gears greased with illusion, powered by ambition. From slum kids to syndicate to empire, the journey had been brutal. But the destination? Power that no law could touch. And in the quiet of his office, under the hum of electric lamps, Thomas Shelby would sometimes pause, listening to the distant sound of the factories, the city alive with the rhythm he had created. It wasn't music, but to him it was the sound of victory. The sound of a man who had turned sin into system. And as he lit another cigarette, he whispered to no one, "The difference between business and crime is who writes the rules." Birmingham had become too small for the Shelbys. By the time the factories hummed with their rhythm and the streets whispered their name, Thomas Shelby realized that true power wasn't in the guns, nor the whiskey, nor the gold. It was in the silence of men who owed you favors. It was in the handshake that didn't make the papers. It was in knowing things other people prayed would stay hidden. He didn't just want to rule the streets anymore. He wanted to rule the people who ruled the streets. That's where the web began. It started with the police. No empire survives without eyes and ears in the law. Tommy understood that better than anyone. Bribing a single constable was easy. Buying silence at the station level was amateur work. He went higher. Inspectors, lieutenants and commissioners, men with families, gambling debts and secrets. He didn't threaten them. He helped them first. A debt quietly cleared. A son offered a job at one of his factories. Then, once they took the favor, he owned a piece of them. Information flowed both ways. Whenever a raid was planned, a quiet phone call warned the right people. Whenever a rival gang got too bold, the same police who were supposed to stop violence ended up protecting the Shelbys by arresting their enemies instead. Birmingham's law enforcement became a chessboard, and Tommy knew every square. Polly managed the finances that made it possible, feeding community donations and pension support into police charity funds that doubled as bribery channels. Arthur's men ensured no officer ever thought of crossing them a single night in a dark alley was enough to remind anyone that loyalty had consequences. But Tommy wasn't after crooked cops. He was after control. And control, he knew, required something stronger than fear. That's where politics entered the game. He began donating to candidates small sums at first, support for rebuilding the city. But with every pound came an expectation. He funded campaigns, financed events, and spoke at public rallies as the face of working-class progress. No one could argue with a war hero turned industrialist who promised jobs and stability. Behind the curtains, the real agenda played out. Those who accepted Shelby money found themselves answering his calls after election night. Zoning permits, land contracts, protection for import businesses. Tommy never asked for too much at once, just enough to make sure every signature benefited his empire. Ada, with her charm and intellect, handled correspondence with MPs. She would invite them for tea, discuss economic plans, slip in a favour for the Shelby Company. To them, she was a reformer, not the sister of Birmingham's most feared man. And through Ada's social circles, Tommy met men who thought they could use him. They didn't realize he was already using them first. The turning point came when his name reached the attention of Winston Churchill. History would one day record their exchanges as communications between a concerned industrialist and the government. In truth, it was a dance between two men who understood the same language power through information. Churchill had heard of the Shelbys through the police and intelligence reports. But rather than crush them, he saw potential. Post-war Britain was fragile riots, unions, Irish rebellion, smuggling. A man like Thomas Shelby could help maintain balance, unofficially. So the letters began. Carefully worded, respectful but laced with intent. Tommy offered assistance in controlling communist elements. Churchill, intrigued, replied with cautious approval. No formal deals, no written confessions, just hints that one hand could quietly steady the other. For Tommy, it wasn't about serving the government. It was about earning immunity. As long as he was useful, he was untouchable. He once told Polly, "When they write the laws, they think they're protecting themselves. But the law only matters until they need men like me." And she, ever the realist, replied, "Then make sure they always need you." That became the Shelby Doctrine. Infiltration became the art form that kept their power alive. By the late 1920s, Tommy had men stationed in offices, factories and ministries, ordinary workers who happened to overhear extraordinary things. Reports came to his desk daily. Shipments, inspections, budget leaks and rival bribes. Knowledge became his currency, and he spent it wisely. Blackmail was never his first weapon, but it was always loaded. He preferred a man's silence willingly given, rather than fearfully forced. But when gentle persuasion failed, the darker methods surfaced. Letters intercepted, photographs taken, affairs exposed. If someone tried to stand above him, he'd remind them of what could fall. One London MP once refused his proposal for land permits. Weeks later, rumours surfaced of that same MP's affair, and the photographs arrived in his wife's mail. The vote changed the next morning. Tommy didn't smile when he heard the news. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "That's the cost of honesty." The Shelby's empire no longer needed bullets to expand. They owned something far more lethal: soft power, reputation, fear, respect, information. Those were their new weapons. A whispered name could close a deal before a contract was signed. A subtle threat could move mountains that dynamite never could. Even enemies began using Shelby intermediaries just to survive. Polly managed the flow of favours like a treasury, deciding who got saved and who didn't. Arthur didn't understand it at first. "What's all this talking, Tom? We used to run the streets with our fists." Tommy looked at him, calm as ever, and said, "Arthur, this is the same fight. We've just changed weapons." Government contracts followed. The Shelby Company Limited began handling import security, industrial consulting, and urban renewal. Each one was a cover for their expanding reach. By appearing indispensable to the establishment, they became part of it. Tommy even began attending parliamentary meetings, dressed in tailored suits, speaking about modern business. The same man who once fixed races now influenced economic policies. The transformation was complete from outlaw to statesman. But he never trusted the people he dined with. He knew power wasn't something you were given. It was something you took and pretended was offered. Behind every polite conversation lay a ledger of leverage. He kept notes on every contact, their debts, their vices, their weaknesses. When he shook a man's hand, he already knew what would break him. His relationship with Churchill deepened during the years of unrest. While officials spoke of stability, Tommy acted as its shadow guardian, arranging quiet resolutions to threats that couldn't make headlines. In return, the government turned its eyes elsewhere when shipments came in under odd paperwork. He wasn't just part of the machine anymore. He was oiling its gears. The irony wasn't lost on him. Once, he fought the system. Now, he was the system, only smarter. He understood that every empire, legal or criminal, ran on the same principle: perception. If people believed you belonged in the room, they stopped asking how you got there. So he crafted that image speeches about workers' rights, donations to hospitals, photographs with politicians. All masks for the same purpose: to keep building his empire under the banner of progress. But influence came with a new kind of danger. He was no longer fighting rivals in alleys. He was dancing with men who could erase him with a single word. The stakes had changed, but Tommy's calm never cracked. He once stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie before meeting a government envoy. Polly asked, "Do you even trust these people?" He answered, "No, but they trust what they owe me." And that was the essence of his power. He didn't conquer men, he made them depend on him. As the 1930s crept closer, the web stretched beyond Birmingham into London, Manchester, even foreign trade ministries. Every thread led back to Tommy's desk, where he sat surrounded by reports, telegrams, and silence. The world thought of him as a businessman. Only a few still remembered he was a soldier, one who never stopped fighting, only changed his battlefield. He used politics the way he once used trenches, digging deep, surviving explosions, moving inch by inch toward an unseen goal. He understood every alliance was temporary, every favor a fuse waiting to burn out. But he didn't need forever. He only needed long enough to build something permanent. By then, the Shelby name had become a paradox feared by criminals, respected by politicians. The newspapers called him the man who bridged two worlds. But those who worked for him knew the truth. There weren't two worlds. there was only his, and everyone else lived inside it. Late one night, after a meeting with a government minister, Tommy stood outside his Birmingham office, cigarette glowing in the fog. Arthur came up beside him and said, "We used to be gangsters." Tommy exhaled smoke into the cold night air and replied, "We still are, Arthur. We've just learned to sit closer to the king." That was the web of power, invisible, untouchable, and unbreakable. No bars, no bullets, no trials. Just influence, information, and the illusion of respect. And as the night deepened, the city slept peacefully under the watch of the man who ruled it without needing to raise his voice. Thomas Shelby, the soldier who turned violence into policy, fear into diplomacy, and sin into strategy. The age of the gangster was ending. The age of the politician had begun. Power always begins with loyalty and ends with fear. The Shelbys understood that better than anyone. For all the money, whiskey, and polished suits, their empire ran not on contracts or signatures, but on obedience, the kind that came from knowing what happened to those who broke it. Arthur kept order the only way he knew, through violence. His fists were the law before the papers were signed. In every pub and alley of Small Heath, his name was a warning. He didn't speak much during negotiations, he didn't have to. One stare from Arthur could silence a room faster than any gunshot. He was chaos contained just enough to be useful, the storm Tommy unleashed only when words failed. Tommy's control, though, came from the opposite side of the coin. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His calm could chill a man more than Arthur's rage ever could. He used silence as a weapon, letting others fill it with their own fear. A man who owes you money will hide. A man who owes you mercy will kneel. Tommy made sure everyone around him owed him both. Between them stood Polly, the keeper of balance. She knew when to let Arthur loose and when to pull him back. She whispered wisdom in Tommy's ear when the line between power and madness blurred. Fear keeps them quiet, she'd tell him, but love keeps them here. And that was the secret the Shelbys ruled, not just through terror, but through belonging. They were family before they were empire. Every soldier, every bookmaker, every messenger boy, they all wore that loyalty like a badge of honor and a curse. But loyalty is a coin that always gets spent. When betrayal came, it cut deeper than any razor. One by one, cracks appeared. A trusted lieutenant tried to pocket extra profits. A rival gang bribed a Shelby contact. And each time the response was swift and surgical. No speeches, no warnings, just disappearance. Bodies found in canals. Names crossed from ledgers. Faces never mentioned again. Tommy never killed in anger that was Arthur's territory. His punishments were lessons. A traitor's house would burn, but his family would be spared so they could live remembering who owned their survival. That was the true cruelty of Thomas Shelby. Mercy delivered as a scar. As the years passed, paranoia replaced peace. Every ally was a potential enemy. Every conversation, a transaction. The closer Tommy got to power, the further he drifted from trust. He could control cities, but not his own thoughts. He had built a kingdom out of fear, and now he lived inside it. The empire had grown too big for Birmingham. By the mid-1920s, the Shelby reach extended far beyond their smoky streets. They dealt with Italians, Irish, Jews, and Americans men whose suits were sharper and knives cleaner. The war for the underworld had gone global, and every empire was meeting its rival. Sarbini was the first true threat. London's racecourses were his domain, and Tommy's expansion into them was an act of war. Sarbini fought with tradition, with bloodlines and reputation. Tommy fought with strategy, the cold patience of a soldier who'd already buried too many friends to fear new enemies. Their conflict wasn't chaos. It was chess played in gunfire. Each hit was retaliation, each truce temporary. And in the end, when Sarbini fell, it wasn't from a bullet, it was from humiliation, being outsmarted by the man from Birmingham he'd once called street trash. Then came Luca Changretta, the ghost from across the ocean. An Italian vendetta wrapped in American money. The Changretta War tested everything the Shelbys had built. Bloodlines against bloodlines, honor against ambition. Tommy didn't just fight for survival. He fought to prove that Birmingham's empire could stand against New York's. Every move was personal, every loss carved into his conscience. By the time the smoke cleared, the Shelbys had won, but victory felt like mourning. Too many graves, too many ghosts. Polly called it the curse of power. Every empire meets its rival. That's how bloodlines are tested. The tests didn't end there. Their influence spread into international smuggling routes across Europe. Whiskey through the docks, shipments wrapped in flags of convenience. Tommy dealt with foreign partners the same way he dealt with enemies, with quiet dominance. He didn't trust anyone. He made everyone trust him. Family diplomacy became their strongest weapon. Ada in the drawing rooms, Polly behind the accounts, Arthur in the shadows, and Tommy on the stage. It was war disguised as business, and for a while it worked perfectly. But even empires built on loyalty eventually rot from within. Success didn't just change their enemies, it changed them. The streets that once united them were now too small for their ambitions. Arthur's violence became unpredictable. John's recklessness grew costly, and Polly began questioning the morality of it all. Each victory came with another piece of themselves left behind. And through it all stood the women, the power behind the power. Polly Gray, the matriarch and the mind. Without her, there would have been no order, no ledger, no legacy. She ruled the family's conscience, even when she disagreed with its direction. Ada, ever independent, refused to be just another Shelby pawn. She believed in progress, in change, in a future where their name meant more than crime. And Grace. Grace was the heart Tommy tried to bury. Her love was both his salvation and his undoing. She saw the man beneath the empire, the soldier still haunted by France, the leader desperate to be more than his sins. When she was gone, something broke that no victory could repair. Each woman shaped the empire differently. Polly gave it wisdom, Ada gave it vision, and Grace gave it humanity. Without them, the Shelbys would have been just another gang. With them, they became legend tragic, flawed, unstoppable. But legends always end the same way. The decline began quietly, not with defeat, but with emptiness. Tommy had built everything he once dreamed of: wealth, influence, control. Yet the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. Meetings replaced friendships. Deals replaced dinners. He sat in rooms of power surrounded by men who smiled, but never trusted him, just as he never trusted them. Arthur was a ghost of himself, torn between loyalty and exhaustion. Polly's warnings grew sharper, her patience shorter. Ada drifted toward politics, seeking something cleaner. And Tommy stared into mirrors, seeing not a leader, but a machine made of promises and pain. He had traded his soul for order, and now there was nothing left to rule but the silence he'd created. The businessman had replaced the gangster. The ghost had replaced the man. Power had eaten its own architect. Every empire ends the same way, not with fire, but with fracture. The family that once swore to die for each other now spoke through lawyers and telegrams. They weren't the Peaky Blinders anymore. They were executives, partners, investors, everything they once despised. Respectability became their new disguise, but it couldn't hide the rot underneath. And yet, even in their fall, the myth only grew stronger. Because the Shelbys didn't just build a criminal network, they built a template. Their methods became the blueprint for every organization that followed. Fear as foundation, loyalty as currency, family as fortress. They proved that crime could be structured like business, and business could be run like war. From razor blades to boardrooms, their influence outlived their sins. Modern empires, corporations, cartels, political dynasties all echoed the same cold principles Thomas Shelby mastered in the back streets of Birmingham. In the end, it wasn't the violence people remembered, it was the vision. The way Tommy turned chaos into order. The way he blurred the line between law and lawlessness until no one could tell the difference. He had become both the villain and the system meant to destroy him. And when the smoke finally cleared, what remained wasn't just a family or a business. It was a philosophy one that said power doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who stay standing after everyone else has fallen. In the dim light of his office, Tommy once whispered to himself, "We didn't just run Birmingham." He paused, looking at the city that had made and unmade him. We rewrote the rules of power. In the end, history doesn't remember who started the war, only who built the world after it. The Peaky Blinders were born from nothing but hunger and ash, soldiers of poverty who turned survival into empire. They didn't wait for permission, they took it. And every time the world told them no, they answered with strategy, blood, and a glass of whiskey raised to no one but themselves. But power has a price always. The streets they ruled became prisons. The loyalty they demanded became chains. Every victory carved another scar. Every betrayal another ghost at the table. Tommy Shelby built an empire that outlived its enemies but not its maker. Because power isn't kept by the strongest hands, it's borrowed from the fear of others. And once that fear fades, all empires crumble the same way. Arthur's rage, Polly's wisdom, Ada's conscience, they were pieces of a kingdom that could never last forever. Even the sharpest blade dulls when it cuts too deep. What began as family turned into business, and what began as ambition ended as addiction to control, to dominance, to being untouchable. And yet, their story still echoes. Every boardroom deal whispered behind closed doors. Every politician who smiles while making threats. They all play the same game the Shelbys perfected. From the smoke of Birmingham to the skyline of London, from ledgers to legislation, the same rule remains. Fear builds power. Power demands loyalty. And loyalty always breaks. Maybe that's why people still talk about them, not because they were saints, but because they were mirrors. They showed the truth behind the glamour, that every fortune has blood beneath it, and every leader carries ghosts in his pocket. Tommy Shelby was never chasing money. He was chasing peace, and peace never came. As the final gunshots faded and the streets fell quiet, the name Peaky Blinders stopped being a threat and became a legend. Not of criminals, but of creators of men and women who took the chaos of their world and shaped it into something bigger than themselves. The empire ended. The myth began. Because in the end, saying the Peaky Blinders didn't just run Birmingham. They rewrote the rules of power.